The world after the war was quiet. Not the good kind of quiet, not always. It was a silence that held memories, a stillness that sometimes felt heavier than the rucksack I once carried through the dust and heat. I had a small house now, a lawn to mow, a dog that slept at my feet. These were the simple things, the anchors that kept me from drifting back to the jungles of my youth. Every Tuesday, I drove my old truck to the Veterans of Foreign Wars Post, VFW Post 78. The hall smelled of stale coffee and old wood. It was a place where ghosts sat beside you, unseen but felt. We were men who understood the language of silence, the weight of a shared glance. We didn't need to tell the big stories, we knew. My life had found a rhythm, a cadence. Wake up, work my job at the lumberyard, come home, walk the dog. On Tuesdays, I would put on a clean shirt and go to the hall. It was a ritual. It was a way to remember without drowning. The men there, they were my brothers. We had different wars, different battlefields etched into our minds. Some had fought on the black sands of Iwo Jima, others in the frozen hills of Korea. My war was Vietnam, the heat, the rain, the fear that was a constant companion. We didn't talk about the killing. We talked about the foolish things, the small jokes, the letters from home that never came. It was a safe place, a sanctuary. The meetings were simple affairs. We'd pledge allegiance to the flag. The flag meant something different to us. It was heavy with the faces of friends who never came home. We'd listen to the post commander read the minutes from the last meeting, budgets and bake sales. Then we would just sit. We would drink coffee that was too strong and eat donuts that were too sweet. Sometimes a younger veteran would show up, fresh from Iraq or Afghanistan. We would welcome them. We would see the same look in their eyes, the look of someone who had seen too much too soon. We were a tribe, bound by something that civilians could never quite grasp. It wasn't about glory, it was about survival. There was a comfort in the routine, the familiar faces. Old man Hemlock, who lost a leg in the Battle of the Bulge, always told the same story about a stolen German motorcycle. Young Miller, a Marine from Fallujah, would just listen, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. We were a collection of broken pieces, but together, in that hall, we felt whole. It was a fragile piece, but it was ours. We had earned it. We had paid for it with our youth, with our innocence, with the parts of ourselves we left behind in foreign lands. The quiet of those Tuesday nights was a balm on old wounds. It was a place to just be. One Tuesday, a new man walked in. He was not like the others. He carried himself with a swagger, a confidence that felt out of place in our quiet hall. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a smile that seemed practiced, rehearsed. He wore a crisp veteran's jacket, and on his chest there was a constellation of medals, a silver star, a bronze star with a V for valor, a purple heart with oak leaf clusters, meaning he had been wounded multiple times. It was a heavy display, a story of incredible bravery told in bits of ribbon and metal. He introduced himself as Sergeant Frank Miller. He said he was new to town, looking for a place to belong. He shook everyone's hand. His grip was firm. His voice was loud, filling the hall in a way no one else's did. He immediately began to tell stories. Not the small, human stories we shared, but grand tales of heroism. He spoke of ambushes and daring rescues. He talked about leading his men through impossible odds. The other veterans listened, their faces polite but guarded. We were not a boastful group. Our heroes were mostly dead. The medals we had were tucked away in dusty boxes, not polished and displayed for all to see. His chest was heavy with valor, but it felt loud. It felt like a performance. I watched him from my usual corner table. I saw the way he touched the medals as he spoke, as if drawing power from them. The purple heart with its clusters. That meant he had been hit, had bled for his country again and again. The silver star, a decoration for gallantry in action, second only to the Medal of Honor. It was the kind of award men died for. To have all of them, it made him a legend. A walking, talking hero right out of a movie. But something felt wrong. It was a feeling in my gut. A quiet alarm bell that had been trained to ring in the presence of danger. In the jungle, you learned to trust that feeling. It kept you alive. He spoke of his time in the Special Forces, the Green Berets. He used the lingo, the acronyms. But it was too perfect, too clean. Like he had learned it from a book, not from the mud and the blood. He called his rifle a gun, a small thing, but soldiers don't call their rifles guns. He talked about his uniform, but he got the placement of a patch wrong. A tiny detail that only someone who had lived in that uniform would notice. The patch on his right shoulder, the combat patch, was from a unit he never mentioned serving with. It was a small crack in the armor, a single thread pulled from a perfect tapestry, and I couldn't look away. The next Tuesday, Frank was there again. He brought a photo album this time. He passed it around, a curated collection of his time and service. There were pictures of him in uniform, standing in front of helicopters, smiling with his team. But the faces of the other men were always slightly blurred, or they were turned away from the camera. The backgrounds were generic: a desert, a jungle. It could have been anywhere. When Old Man Hemlock asked him about a specific operation in the Korangal Valley, a place known for its brutal fighting, Frank's answer was vague. He waved his hand and talked about the fog of war, how all the valleys started to look the same. I kept my distance. I just listened. He told a story about a firefight where his M16 rifle had jammed. He described clearing the jam, but the way he explained it was wrong. He described a procedure for a different weapon system, a newer one, not the one we carried in Vietnam, the era he claimed for some of his service. It was another small thing, a detail that would slide past most people. But for those of us who had spent countless hours cleaning and maintaining those rifles, who knew their every quirk and flaw, it was a glaring mistake. It was like a carpenter describing how to hammer a nail but holding the hammer backward. His stories were always about his own bravery. He was always the one who saved the day, the one who charged the enemy, the one who carried the wounded to safety. War is not like that. It is a thing of chaos and confusion, of luck, good and bad. Heroism is often quiet, desperate, and unwitnessed. It is giving your last canteen of water to a friend. It is holding a dying soldier's hand. It is not a movie script. Frank's stories were clean, with a clear beginning, middle, and end. Real war stories are messy. They bleed into each other. They have no neat conclusions. They just stay with you, forever. I started to watch him more closely. I noticed the way his eyes would dart around the room as he told his tales, as if checking to see if we were buying it. He never seemed to connect with anyone. He talked at us, not with us. The other veterans were polite, but a quiet space was growing around Frank's table. They would nod and listen, but they wouldn't share their own stories with him. There was an invisible wall building up. He was in the room, but he was not one of us. He was wearing the uniform, but it was a costume. The weight of his medals was not the weight of memory. It was the weight of a lie. I couldn't let it go. It was a splinter in my mind. That night I went home and sat at my old desk. The internet was a tool I rarely used, a world that felt foreign and loud, but I knew it held records, lists, names. I started with the Silver Star. There are official databases, lists of recipients. I typed in his name, Frank Miller. I searched through the records for the Vietnam era, then for the more recent conflicts he hinted at. I scrolled through page after page of names, names of real heroes, men who had shown extraordinary gallantry. His name was not there, not for the Silver Star, not for the Bronze Star with valor. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. It was one thing to have a feeling, a suspicion. It was another to see the proof, or the lack of it, in black and white on a computer screen. I then searched the rolls of the Purple Heart. This was harder. The records are vast, but there are registries, organizations that keep track. I spent hours searching. Frank Miller, nothing. I tried different spellings. Francis Miller, Franklin Miller. The screen just stared back at me, blank. It was almost 3 in the morning. The house was silent, except for the clicking of the keyboard and the soft breathing of my dog. The quiet felt different now. It felt heavy with deceit. My search became an obsession. I requested records through the Freedom of Information Act. It was a slow process, a journey through bureaucratic mazes. I wanted his official military service record, the DD Form 214. Every veteran has one. It is the story of your service written in codes and boxes. It lists your units, your dates of service, your awards, your reason for discharge. It is the undeniable truth. While I waited for the official papers, I looked for him in other ways. I searched for any mention of a Sergeant Frank Miller from the units he claimed, in news articles or historical archives. There was nothing. He was a ghost, a man with a detailed past that left no trace. A week later, a plain envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was the official response. I opened it with trembling hands. The report was short. It confirmed that a Frank Miller had served in the United States Army, but his record was not what he claimed. He had served for 2 years. He was a supply clerk. He had never been in combat. He had never been deployed overseas. He was discharged honorably, but his highest award was a Good Conduct Medal. He was never a sergeant. He was never a Green Beret. The medals on his chest, the stories he told, the entire identity he had built for himself in our hall, it was all a fabrication. A stolen history, a stolen valor. The next Tuesday, I walked into the VFW hall with the papers in my jacket pocket. They felt heavy like a stone. Frank was already there, holding court at his usual table. He was in the middle of a story, his voice booming. He was talking about a close call in Saigon during the Tet Offensive. I knew from his records he had been working in a supply depot in Fort Dix, New Jersey at the time. The other veterans listened, some with polite smiles, others with a tired resignation. They seemed to have accepted him as a fixture, a harmless storyteller. But it wasn't harmless. It was a theft. He was stealing the honor of men who had paid the ultimate price. I waited for him to finish his story. The room fell into a brief silence as he took a sip of his coffee, basking in the attention. That was my moment. I stood up and walked to the front of the hall, next to the post commander. I didn't feel angry. I just felt a deep, profound sadness. "Frank," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the low chatter. Everyone turned to look at me. Frank's smile faltered. "I have something to say." I took the papers out of my pocket. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply read. I read his real service record. I read the dates. The job title. Supply clerk. The location. Fort Dix, New Jersey. The award's Army Service Ribbon. National Defense Service Medal. Good Conduct Medal. With each word, the air in the room grew colder, heavier. I could see the color drain from Frank's face. His swagger evaporated. He seemed to shrink in his chair. The broad-shouldered hero was gone, replaced by a small, frightened man. The other veterans stared at him. Their faces were not angry, but filled with a deep collective disappointment. It was the look of a sacred trust being broken. When I finished reading, I placed the papers on the table. The silence in the hall was absolute. It was louder than any explosion. No one said a word. Frank Miller stood up slowly. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. He stared at the floor as he walked towards the door. His shoulders were slumped. The medals on his chest seemed to mock him, their bright colors suddenly garish and cheap. He opened the door and stepped out into the night, disappearing without a word. The door clicked shut, and the silence he left behind was filled with the ghosts of the real heroes whose stories he had tried to steal. After he left, the hall remained quiet for a long time. No one moved, no one spoke. The coffee grew cold in our cups. The donuts sat untouched. We just looked at the empty chair where Frank had sat. It felt like a wound in the room. Old man Hemlock finally broke the silence. He shook his head slowly. "To want it that bad," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "To want to have been there. It's a sad thing." He was right. There was no victory in what I had done. There was no triumph. There was only a hollow, aching sadness. I had unmasked a liar, but what was left was just a pathetic man's desperation. I thought about why he did it. What makes a man steal the suffering of others and wear it as a badge of honor? Maybe he felt small, maybe he felt invisible. Maybe he looked at us, at the men who had been to war, and saw a kind of meaning he felt was missing from his own life. He wanted the brotherhood. He wanted the respect, but he didn't understand that those things are not won with medals or stories. They are forged in shared hardship, in the quiet understanding of what was lost. He wanted the glory without the price. He didn't know that for us there was very little glory, there was only the cost. As I drove home that night, the streets were empty. The town was asleep. I thought about the medals tucked away in a drawer in my bedroom. I hadn't looked at them in years. They didn't represent heroism to me. They represented survival. They were reminders of the friends who didn't get to come home, who didn't get to have a quiet life, a dog, or a Tuesday night meeting at the VFW. True honor wasn't something you could pin to your chest. It was something you carried inside you. It was in the way you lived your life after the war. It was in remembering the fallen, quietly, honestly. I pulled into my driveway and cut the engine. My dog came to the door, his tail wagging. In the quiet of my home, I understood something. The fight wasn't about exposing a fraud like Frank. The real struggle was for men like me and the men at the hall to find peace in the silence, to live with the ghosts, to carry the weight of our real stories, not the glorious ones, but the true ones. He wanted to wear our history as a costume, but our history was not a costume. It was a part of our skin, a part of our souls, and its weight was something no imposter could ever truly bear.